opportunity to speak to Bill C-22 and more broadly to the situation confronting Canadians living with disabilities. Now, Bill C-22 proposes a new federal financial benefit for Canadians living with disabilities. However, does not actually define many aspects of the structure of this benefit. So I'll be voting in favor of this legislation because I agree with the principle of providing the support, but I am concerned about some of the lacking substance in terms of how this benefit would actually work. Increasingly, we see from this government a desire to limit the actual work of Parliament in defining the nature and scope of programs. Instead, the government wants a blank check from Parliament, legislation that authorizes ministers to shape and define a program independently according to their discretion. In general, this is not a good way for governments to operate in a democracy, and in particular, I do not think this government has shown itself trustworthy when it comes to working out the details of critical programs. When it comes to the structure of this benefit, the government's message is just trust us. But from a government that cannot figure out how to deliver passports in a timely manner, cannot address the affordability crisis, and cannot secure our borders, the message of just trust us seems rather hollow. Now, I have two specific concerns about the prospective structure of this program that I do want to highlight. First, I share the concern of many about how this program would interact with other existing programs, including those provided at the provincial level. If a new federal benefit leads to a loss of eligibility for other existing benefits, then it would leave people worse off overall. It is not inevitable that this would be the case, but this is a matter that will require careful and respectful dialogue with other levels of government and hard work at every stage, hard work that this government hasn't always been prepared to do. So at this point, the government is passing broad framework legislation without ensuring that it will actually leave Canadians with disabilities better off in every case. The government doesn't have to wait for this legislation to pass to begin those discussions, and I would encourage them to actively engage those discussions now about protecting existing benefits, because aspects of those dialogues may inform suggested amendments. Madam Chair, the second concern I have is that it's critically important that the structure of this benefit program protect access for Canadians with disabilities who are working or trying to get into work. Even with existing benefit programs at other levels, certain Canadians with disabilities may find themselves in a position where entering the workforce actually leaves them worse off. It is critically important that work always leaves people better off financially. Supporting Canadians, including Canadians living with disabilities, in being able to access meaningful work has long been a key priority for Conservatives. And why is this important? Overwhelmingly because Canadians of all backgrounds and circumstances want to be able to work and are happier and more fulfilled if they are able to work. In this context, by work, I don't just mean commodified work, but work of any sort, where individuals exert themselves in order to contribute positively to the world around them. The science of happiness and fulfillment measurement shows us that work generally makes people happier by providing them with meaning and with a workplace-based community and with a greater level of power and agency. So quite apart from the notably important income-earning properties of work, work also provides meaning and happiness totally independent of whether or not it generates income. Now, the think tank Cardis has done excellent work on this question of work and disability, and they found that most Canadians living with disabilities want to work or want to work more. But also they found that the vast majority of public policy focus and money has been towards income support as opposed to supports that help people get into work. Now, the critical point about work support and income support is that they are not mutually exclusive. In fact, often they are necessarily complementary. Some people require income support in order to afford the resources and transportation required to find and get a job in the first place. And if income supports are withdrawn immediately once people work or start work, they may not be able to afford vital necessities as well as the things they need to sustain them in their new job. So having both fulfilling work and steady income are vital for human happiness and fulfillment. Having income without work or work without income are both, in a sense, problematic. Now, of course, having income isn't just about fulfillment and happiness, it's about basic survival. Canadians with disabilities need income to take care of their own needs and the needs of those they love. Now, for most of us, work comes with earning income. However, when benefit programs are poorly structured, people may actually be forced to choose between work and income because benefits are cut off or income is lost as a result of working. In such cases, given how essential income is for survival, people will understandably choose income over work if they are forced to choose between these things. But it is cruel and pointless to force people to make this choice, to choose between the happiness associated with work and receiving the financial support that they need. Income supports for Canadians with disabilities can and should go hand in hand with workplace support. and only peeling those income supports back gradually when it is clear that income support is not required because of the level that an individual is able to work. Now, we saw an example of this terrible choice between work and income with the poorly constructed CERB program during the pandemic. Unemployed Canadians who were accessing CERB, who were then offered part-time work, were in many cases actually worse off financially if they took that work, because part-time work would likely push them over the threshold for CERB eligibility, even if they were not earning close to what they would have been entitled to receive under CERB. Thus, people were forced to remain out of work in order to access the resources that they needed to support their families. And not only does this make zero financial or economic sense to create a financial disincentive to work, but it puts people in the painful position of needing to choose between the happiness and dignity that comes from work on the one hand and financial security on the other hand. That is why we feel it is very important that this new federal program be structured such that Canadians with disabilities, many of whom can and do work or want to work, are not rendered worse off by entering the workforce. Now, there is nothing in the text of this bill to suggest that it couldn't be structured in a way to ensure that work always pays, but the past record of this government gives us significant cause for concern. In the 42nd Parliament, the member for Carleton, now the leader of the Conservative Party, proposed Bill C-395, a bill specifically designed to address this problem of work sometimes bringing about a loss in benefits for Canadians living with disabilities. Bill C-395 would have amended the Provincial Fiscal Arrangements Act to ensure that in negotiations around transfers and the construction of benefits for Canadians living with disabilities, people with disabilities would not lose more through taxation and the reduction of benefits than they gain as a result of working. It would have protected Canadians with disabilities from these kinds of perverse situations where they would have to choose between the happiness that comes from work or the financial security that comes from government benefits. Now, if Bill C-395 was the law of the land, then we could pass this bill even as written with the confidence that the benefits constructed would leave people better off. But when it came to a vote on Bill C-395, Liberals actually opposed it. Liberals opposed this common sense proposal from our leader to ensure that Canadians who work are better off as a result of the money they earn. Now, sadly, Liberals don't seem to appreciate the value, dignity, and happiness that comes from hard work. Now, I'm not sure if it could be found in the scope of this legislation as written, but I would welcome amendments that would capture the spirit of our leader's past work to protect Canadians with disabilities from being punished for working. Now, parenthetically, Mr. Speaker, on this subject, Madam Speaker, excuse me, I want to say something directly to employers about hiring Canadians with disabilities. The research done by Cardis shows that many employers have an exaggerated perception of the costs associated with accommodation. Cardis's work shows that including and accommodating employees with disabilities is often much cheaper than employers initially expect, and that funding may be available from different levels of government for businesses, including small businesses, to seek to accommodate customers and employees living with disabilities. Now, further, as our leader has previously shared in the context of speaking to C-395, there are so many cases of Canadians with disabilities who make incredible, committed, and loyal employees and who bring unique competencies to the workplace. Governments have a responsibility to ensure that poorly structured benefit programs do not undermine the ability of Canadians to access work. But employers also need to lead in pushing aside stereotypes and recognizing the contributions that Canadians with disabilities can make to their workplace. Many employers are already doing this, and I congratulate those that are doing this already. Now, Speaker, these were the main points that I wanted to make on C-22, but I also think it's very important to speak to the context of the legislation. And that is the significant negative impacts on the lives of Canadians living with disabilities that flow from the government's radical ableist approach to euthanasia, their so-called MAID regime. We simply cannot have a conversation about financial benefits separate from a recognition about the biggest threat to the lives of Canadians living with disabilities. That those with disabilities are much more likely, those without disabilities are much more likely to be offered suicide prevention and recovery support, while our brothers and sisters, cousins, and friends who are living with disabilities are being denied those supports and actively pushed towards death, even if they are saying they don't want it. Now, among those who support legal euthanasia around the world, Canada is still increasingly seen as a cautionary tale, a warning of what not to do. Now, in this vein, I want to start with a bit of history. Euthanasia in Canada started with Bill C-14, passed in the 42nd Parliament. This legislation affixed the name medical assistance in dying to what had previously been called euthanasia, the process of doctors killing a consenting patient. Now, that legislation sought to define a regime whereby people could choose hastened death if their death was deemed reasonably foreseeable. Now, I criticized the legislation at the time for, among other things, not being sufficiently clear about what was actually meant by reasonably foreseeable. Indeed, there were significant abuses even in the immediate aftermath of the passage of the legislation, whereby doctors determined someone's death to be reasonably foreseeable based on a string of hypotheticals and where a person had nothing approaching a terminal condition. For example, back in 2016, I highlighted a case in Vancouver where a physician declared a depressed person eligible for euthanasia without examining them because that patient, quote, could easily get bed sores and then die of infection, end quote. A person's death was, prior to examination, declared reasonably foreseeable because the person could theoretically die from an as yet uncontracted bed sore infection if they were bedbound as a result of their depression. These were the kind of perverse outcomes that were possible even in 2016 as a result of the lack of safeguards and the ambiguity around what was meant by reasonably foreseeable. Now, the current rules allow someone also to consult many different physicians before finding two who will approve. So if 20 or 200 doctors say no criteria are met, but then two say yes criteria were met, then the killing of the patient can proceed. The ambiguity and the opportunity to consult multiple doctors before getting the desired result means that indeed the holes were and still are large enough to drive a truck through. So these were the pre-existing problems that were already, in particular, raising concerns of the disability community. The lack of clarity around what were and were not circumstances where death was reasonably foreseeable opened the door for people who were living with disabilities being encouraged to pursue MAID, even if they didn't want to, and even if they were actually not eligible. You don't have to take my word for it, because the minister responsible for this legislation, the Minister of Employment, Workforce Development, and Disability Inclusion of Canada, actually said during subsequent discussion of C7, she said, quote, I regularly hear from families who are appalled by the fact that they take their child, potentially their older child, in and are offered unprovoked MAID. I think that has to stop, end quote. That's from a minister in this government. So this was already the context following the passage of C14 and prior to the passage of Bill C7. Now, the road to C7 was much more contrived than the road to C14. The already nebulous reasonable foreseeability clause was challenged, and a lower court in one province proposed to overturn this restriction. The federal government could have appealed that lower court decision, and indeed had a strong basis for doing so. An appeal would, at the very least, have given parliamentarians more time to consider a broad range of legislative options. Instead, the government made a political choice to embrace the court ruling, the lower court ruling, and the artificial timeline it created, pushing medical assistance in dying for Canadians with disabilities. This was not about following a court ruling. This was about something the government could have appealed, but they wanted to use the court ruling to advocate for a long-standing objective. So following this contrived process, the government put forward Bill C7, which was rightly opposed by all of the leading organizations representing Canadians living with disabilities, as well as by domestic and international human rights authorities. Krista Carr from Inclusion Canada said the following. Inclusion Canada has advocated for safeguards in MAID since we intervened in the Carter case. Our biggest fear has always been that having a disability would become an acceptable reason for state-provided suicide. Bill C7 is our worst nightmare. By having a disability itself under Bill C7 as the justification for the termination of life, the very essence of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms would be shattered. Discrimination on the basis of disability would again be entrenched in Canadian law, end quote. She says further, quote, the singling out of one particular group of people based on their personal characteristics that happens to be a protected ground under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and to use that reason as grounds to justify the termination of the lives of the people who have those characteristics is just wrong, and we wouldn't consider doing this. We would never consider doing this for any other group of people, Indigenous, racialized, LGBTQ. Another quotation, Dr. Heidi Jans from the Council of Canadians with Disabilities. She says, people with disabilities are at a higher risk of suicide due to systemic and internalized ableism, yet they face substantial barriers when trying to access suicide prevention services. Medical professionals overlook typical sources of stress. Problems arising from relationship breakdowns, depression, and isolation are wrongly attributed to disability. The removal of reasonable foreseeable natural death as a limiting eligibility criteria for the provision of MAID will result in people with disabilities seeking MAID as an ultimate capitulation to a lifetime of ableist oppression, end quote. And finally, Bonnie Brayton from the Disabled Women's Network of Canada pointed out, quote, Bill C7 is sadly lacking in any meaningful public consultation with any people with disabilities, despite how much more profoundly it could affect anyone who lives with a disability, end quote. The disability community overwhelmingly opposed C7 and has repeatedly raised concerns about negative pressure and coercion impacting Canadians living with disabilities. Okay, so what about autonomy? The government would argue that C7 provides people with disabilities with the option of medically facilitated death, but they don't have to choose that option. It's just another option that people have. To this, I would note that autonomy is always expressed in a social, legal, and economic context. Now, that context is that many Canadians living with disabilities struggle to access key supports and services that they need. We don't have sufficient workplace supports in place, and there are gaps in terms of community and income support. In that context, the law and the medical system say to a person living with this disability, you have a simple way out. You can choose to die. If you are at a point of existential agony and you have a disability, then the system will offer death as a supposed solution. So in effect, Madam Speaker, if a person like me without a disability is experiencing existential distress and suicidal ideation, and if I were to discuss that distress with a doctor, I would be offered suicide prevention. But if a person with a disability, the same as me in every other respect, is experiencing the same existential distress and suicidal ideation, and they discuss their distress with a doctor, they will be offered suicide facilitation by that same medical system. Now, that difference in the way the law and the health system treat those living with and without disabilities obviously sends a message to everyone involved in those interactions about whose life the law and the health system deem to be more or less worth living. This Liberal government has built a staircase to suicide prevention and a ramp to suicide facilitation. So as much as members opposite would like to say that this is about autonomy, the social and legal context that the government has created is not neutral, and it is, in fact, discriminatory. Disability rights groups overwhelmingly see this reality, which is why they have been diametrically opposed to the approach of this government, and so much for nothing about us without us. Canadians with disabilities feel devalued by a system that offers them easy death and does not offer them critical supports to live. Sadly, the mentality of the medical system is changing as well in response to these legal changes. The House has heard from many witnesses at different times and in different communities where patients were repeatedly pushed towards death and even called selfish for rejecting that option. Again, I will quote the minister, who said herself, I regularly hear from families who are appalled by the fact that they take their child, potentially their older child, in and are offered unprovoked MAID. I think that this has to stop. In response to the testimony that we have heard, Conservatives sought to amend C7 to guarantee that a physician or other healthcare worker would not raise euthanasia or MAID with a patient unless the patient raises it first. This amendment would have ensured that, for instance, a person with a disability who goes to a doctor for something unrelated will not be offered facilitated death out of the blue. This would have solved the problem that the minister actually identified. But the government opposed this conservative.
Je dois interrompre l'honorable député. J'ai un rappel au règlement.
I have to interrupt the honourable member. A point of order. The honourable member for Rivière-des-Mille. Madam Speaker, with all due respect for my colleague, he is completely off topic. We are talking about giving financial support to persons living with disabilities, but for the past 10 minutes, my colleague has been talking about a totally different subject, that is, medical assistance in dying. So I would like the colleague to get back on track, please, Madam Speaker. I understand, I take this point of order, but as you know, we do have some tolerance in accepting that members talk about various topics, but I would request that the member continue to talk about Bill C-22, which we're currently debating.
The rights I'm given by the House to speak about this pertinent issue, which fundamentally relates to this legislation. The government doesn't want to hear from the many concerns raised by Canadians living with disabilities, that this is critically linked to their quality of life, the fact that the structures that the government has put in place are denying vital supports to Canadians who need it, and pushing them towards this widening door that the government has offered when it comes to facilitated suicide. Again, the minister said, I regularly hear from families who are appalled by the fact that they take their child, potentially their older child, in and are offered unprovoked MAID. I think this has to stop. Of course, this government wants to go even further. Next year in March, euthanasia for those with depression or other mental health challenges will become explicitly legal, and the government is now studying euthanasia for children. In the world imagined by their current trajectory, a parent could bring a teenager suffering from depression to a counselor and find that that teenager is being offered suicide facilitation instead of suicide prevention support. And recently, Dr. Louis Roy from the Quebec College of Physicians recently recommended that euthanasia be legalized for infants with certain disabilities. Imagine it, Mr. Speaker. Someone would actually come to a parliamentary committee in Canada, recommend the killing of young children because of their disability. So much for autonomy, Madam Speaker. So much for autonomy. I would hope the government would have denounced the vile views expressed by Mr. Roy. So far, they have not.
I do invite the honourable member to bring us back to C22. We are going really into a totally different bill. Please, you have 1 minute. The honourable member has 1 minute
Madam
left.
Speaker, I expect better when it comes to ruling on the rules. You know that there is broad latitude, and I have a 20-minute speech.
Absolutely.
And I spent the overwhelming first half of the speech discussing financial benefits.
May I
said that I would spend the second half of the speech.
May I interrupt the honourable member to remind him that yes, I was very broad in my interpretation of how the rules work, and the member had ample time to expose precisely the arguments the honourable member has been bringing forth. But we are 1 minute left into the speech, and I would like to remind the honourable member to bring us back to C22. That's all I'm saying. The honourable parliamentary secretary to the government house leader.
Madam Speaker, what I find to be extremely offensive of what just took place towards you is the member pointed at you and said he expected better from you. That is not the way that any member of this House should treat the chair, not even the individual, but the respect that is supposed to be shown to the chair. And I would, through you, encourage that member to apologize to the chair.
Thank you. Thank the honourable member for his care, but I think we, in this chair, we know that we are subject to displeasing members, so the honourable member may proceed.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's very clear that members of the government, members of the bloc, don't want to hear about the subject. That is a pressing priority for Canadians living with disabilities. They would prefer to talk about, oh, we're introducing this generic framework legislation with no particulars. But they don't want to talk about the fact that they've been called out by every disability rights organization in this country for the fact that they have put in place a framework that is denying vital supports to Canadians with disabilities while widening the push for Canadians facing disabilities towards facilitated death. People living with disabilities have a great deal to contribute to society, and they need to be offered workplace supports alongside income supports. We also need to recognize that a person's dignity is not dependent on their circumstances or their context or their perceived productivity or ability to contribute, that human dignity is inherent in all human beings. I will vote for C22 while maintaining extreme concern about the way that this government views and treats Canadians living with disabilities and their apparent lack of desire to hear from parliamentarians and to hear from those organizations, those legitimate concerns that those organizations are repeatedly raising.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Beaches East York.
Thanks, Madam Speaker. I was going to make a joke about figures of speech and the need to educate my friend about figures of speech after reading his Twitter feed. But what I wanted to ask him about is specifically around the quantum that he thinks should be realized, because he spoke about the vagueness of the legislation and the punting of some of the eligibility criteria and the punting of the quantum to the regulations. I think it's a fair criticism. And in the Old Age Security Act, we don't do that as Parliament. Having said that, I'd be curious, would the member support a submission to finance for the coming budget cycle to say that the amount should be no less for people with disabilities of working age than it is for low-income seniors?
For Sherwood Park for Saskatchewan.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm not prepared to name a specific number on the fly, but I do agree in principle with my colleague that it would be legitimate to submit recommendations from parliamentarians trying to provide parameters around the appropriate numbers. And I think that should just be done in the context of not just saying a specific number for benefit, but also prescribing how that federal benefit would interact with benefits at other levels, and also how it would interact with the issues I raised about the need to provide appropriate support for Canadians entering the workforce.
Le député de Rivière-des-Mille-Îles.
The honourable member for Rivière-des-Mille-Îles. Madam Speaker, I'd like to continue in the same direction as I was speaking before. I'm a little outraged that we're using time in this House to talk about things that have nothing to do with the debate, talking about MAID, talking about access to suicide, using terms like killing children. This is outrageous speech. I'm extremely shocked. This is a serious bill that the Bloc will be supporting. We're trying to financially help people that have disabilities, and spending 20 minutes on that bothers me even more. The honourable
Member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan.
Speaker, I wish the member was more offended by the realities on the ground in this country and by the impact that that has on the lives of Canadians with disabilities than he is by the fact that I've raised those issues in the House. Now, he didn't like the fact that I referenced killing children. Dr. Louis Roy from the Quebec College of Physicians gave testimony before a committee of this House in which he recommended offering euthanasia, quote unquote, offering it to children who are less than 1 year old. Maybe the member didn't have a chance to see that testimony. I would encourage him to review that testimony. I think it's highly relevant to this conversation. Because if the message we're giving to parents who have children with disabilities, if the message we're giving to Canadians with disabilities is that, well, we're working hard to pave this easy way out, so-called, that has a great deal to do with the conversation we're having today.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Victoria.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I'm going to focus on the very beginning of the member's speech, where he talked a bit about the need to support people with disabilities in the workplace. And I've had disability advocates, people with lived experience come to me and talk about how it's not only discrimination in hiring, but it's actually about accommodation and accessibility in workplaces. And that if we want people to feel welcome in the workplace, we need to ensure that ableist policies are gotten rid of and that we do everything we can to accommodate people with disabilities. Here in the House of Commons, this is an ableist workplace. And for people who want to run and become members of Parliament, people with disabilities, virtual Parliament would be a huge step in ensuring that we have policies that support accommodation and accessibility. I'm curious if the member can respond to those comments.
Member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan.
I was with the member most of the way. I agree that all the things she spoke about in terms of accommodations are important. The House of Commons has within its standing orders provisions that allow any standing order to be abrogated in order to accommodate a member with a disability. And I think that's important and that's positive. I believe that there are ways to achieve that accommodation without virtual Parliament. My sense is that there are many members who are keen on taking advantage of virtual Parliament, who are zooming in from their own offices, even on Parliament Hill. I think that the institution can accommodate and has accommodated Canadians, elected officials with disabilities outside of a virtual context. But I certainly agree that accommodation is very important. And I think Cardis' research identifying that for employers, the costs of accommodation are actually much lower than are often initially expected. That research is very important as well, and hopefully encouraging to employers that are considering doing more in this area.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Kitchener Centre.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It was 2 or 3 weeks ago now that we had this same debate on C-22 in this House and heard members of all parties communicate their support for C-22. In the time since, I put forward a unanimous consent motion on that basis to move it to committee so that amendments could be proposed to move forward with getting this benefit to Canadians with disabilities. Can the member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan, speak to what he could do to get support from parliamentarians in this place to move on with getting C-22 to committee?
Honourable Member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Important opportunity to talk about how legislation is scheduled in this place, right? Because the government has most of the days, and the government schedules when legislation takes place. So what the government has done with C-22 is they scheduled it for 1 day of debate, and then they didn't schedule it for weeks and weeks. And then they said, how come this legislation hasn't passed? Well, clearly the legislation needs to have a certain amount of time being debated in the House. But if the government sets this as a priority, and I think it should be a priority, they could have scheduled it for a number of days in that first week. We could have completed second reading debate right up front. But it's a bit unreasonable for the government to say, well, if we're going to move this bill forward, you have to agree to adopt it, even while we fail to prioritize it in terms of our selection of the bills. So I think C-22 should be a priority. I would encourage the government to prioritize it in their selection of days so that we can indeed complete the debate that's required on the issues around it and move it forward.
Honourable for Souris Moose Mountain.
Madam Speaker, and I appreciate the opportunity. I thank my colleague for his speech and his comments and many issues that he's brought up. And it's interesting when I hear and around the room, ultimately, I have an earpiece here that I have to use because I can't hear, and I'm deaf in one ear, and people don't understand that, and because they can't see my disability. and because I don't talk about my disability. But then there's a big concern about that, because during COVID, for people with disabilities who are disabled because of hearing, with masks, we read lips. And we couldn't read lips because we couldn't hear things. And we heard comments from people who said, you're speaking too loud. Well, it's because we speak loud because we can't hear and understand that. And that invisible disability is extremely important to a lot of our disabled people. I'd like to speak, quickly, Madam Speaker, a member who is basically 43 years old. He has 4 children, and he's lost that ability to raise his children. He had cochlear implants put in. And his concerns with this legislation are the fact that there's regulations, but it doesn't tell him what he can do and how he can get back to work. And I'm wondering if the member would mind commenting on those invisible disabilities and the ability for people getting back to work.
Sherwood Park for Saskatchewan.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I think the member raises many important points, in particular recognizing the diversity of disabilities that exist. When we talk about disability, that could include many different kinds of things that in a particular social context make it harder for them to do a job that they could otherwise do. And we need to recognize that not all forms of disability fit with what our expectations might be. Not all forms of disability are visible. And that's why this program needs to be well constructed, it needs to be versatile, and it needs to encourage accommodations for people that respond to their particular circumstances. It's why we would like to see and would like to have seen more details on this from the government or the legislation, and these are important questions we need to be asking at committee.
Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader, Senate.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Going back to the preceding question that was asked by the member from Kitchener Centre, I don't disagree with the member from Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan, that he is right. It's the government that sets the days and the agenda. But a lot of this place operates in good faith. You have to operate under the assumption that you want to move forward to eventually get to a place of voting on a particular bill. The problem is, and this member knows it better than probably most conservatives, what conservatives do is they do various different tactics to slow the day down. They'll move a motion of concurrence that burns away 3 hours. Then they'll put in some points of order in there, again, to burn more time, to try to burn away a day. It's very clear and it's very obvious to Canadians as a whole that the conservatives do use multiple tactics to slow down anything getting through this House because they want to see this government fail. That's their objective, and that's their motive behind it, and this member knows that.
Part for Saskatchewan, 15 seconds.
Madam Speaker, just look at the facts. This fall, the House has sat for about 3 weeks. Conservatives have given unanimous consent to expedite 2 pieces of legislation, Bill C-29 and Bill C-30. So that's a pretty impressive breakneck speed for the opposition to agree to the option of certain pieces of legislation. This is only the second half day we've debated C-22, and yes, it needs to be debated. But we support the legislation. We want it to move forward. We want the government to do better. And look, debate in Parliament is part of the process.
Resuming debate, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to